Hey there, interwebs, I hope you're all doing well, and for today's video, I'm technically going to be reviewing a book for all of you, because not only do I think it is one of the most passionate and insightful books that I have read on trans issues lately, it is also one of the most concise, coming in at, I think, less than 200 pages, less than 175 pages actually, and yet it manages to be one of the most thoughtful, mind-opening, and insightful books that I have read on the topic of gender and trans issues in the last few years. And that is the book Trans Rad Femme by Talia Bhatt. Hey there! So, some of you might notice that this is actually the second upload of this video review of this book. And yeah, that it's much, much longer. Don't look at the time code, y'all. But the reason for that is because after I first posted this video, a number of critiques about the book came to my attention, some about the book itself, but actually most around the book, and they were critiques that I thought were important enough to include within the review itself. And originally, this video was going to be just a short off-the-cuff review and recommendation of a book that I personally found very interesting, and it's part of a larger goal that I've set for myself this year to highlight and support more trans artists and writers. This happened to be the one I read most recently, so it felt like a good place for me to start this project. And I'm currently in the middle of a few bigger projects that I can't really talk about just yet that are outside of YouTube, but will hopefully be done by the end of the summer, at least in terms of the predominant amount of my work. So I wanted to make space for videos that I wanted to do, but also were a little more casual and unscripted and off the cuff, and that was definitely the original vibe and intent of the first version of this review. But that said, the criticisms that I saw were thoughtful, substantial, and in some cases, things that I had genuinely wished I had been more aware of or more critical of in my original video. And so I did briefly take that video down and consider just not re-uploading or doing anything with it, just letting it go. But ultimately, I think it's more valuable to re-upload it with these concerns acknowledged and at least explored briefly, because some of the discourse around this book really, I think, is honestly worth talking about, even if I don't have the time to give it like a deep dive essay that I would normally like to. And I think it would be irresponsible not to at least raise the points that I've seen and open up a space for good faith discussion around them, because it's a larger topic that I think we should be talking about openly in spaces. So that's what this version of the video is. I hope you'll all give me the grace to know that I'm trying to approach this in good faith, both towards those offering the critiques of the book, as well as towards those who like the book, as well as the author herself. I'm not here to take a side or draw a hard line on any of these issues that I'm discussing. I'm just sharing the criticisms that I've seen and where I feel it's appropriate, adding my own thoughts and responses to them. And my ultimate feeling is I still want to recommend the book, but as part of a much larger conversation, one that critically engages with its ideas and acknowledges where it might fall short and treats it as something worth discussing, not just taking at face value, but engaging in a discourse around. A good faith discourse, not a capital D online discourse that a lot of these things usually fall into. So just want to add that, and I will be popping back in throughout to add some addendums. Now, as many of you can see from the bookshelf behind me, and actually most of these books that I'm going to be talking about are kind of on the shelf below here, I actually read a ton of books about gender theory. There's like 20 books by Judith Butler just hanging out right on that shelf right off screen. In fact, you might be able to see some of them. And so while I certainly love to be up to date on the latest conversations, there's always evolutions in the field of philosophy and discussing gender and things like that. It's hard for me to sort of find a book that really just like hits me in the gut of like, oh wow, I hadn't really thought of that. And this book, especially in its last segment of the book, really did that for me, because what Trans Rad Femme is Talia basically going back to second wave feminism, radical feminism, this sort of a movement that what we now think of as TERFs, gender critical feminists, kind of came out of, and going back to reassess it and say, actually, they were on to something with their criticism of gender and really defining misogyny as a defining and major force underlying much of the bigotries that we see today. And the reason that that's kind of a radical thought is because, as I alluded to a second ago, second wave feminism did kind of grow into what we think of as TERFs today. Gender critical feminists come out of that same sort of history of radical feminism. We can see that lineage most clearly in the works of Janice Raymond, who many trans people will know wrote an anti-transgender book that was really this sort of Bible for a lot of TERFs that pushed a lot of this second wave feminist issues. And what Talia is bringing to the fore in her book is to say, the problem, as is quite often the problem, is that a lot of these feminists that were building this second wave feminist theory were centering white feminism, and in particular white cis feminism, and not interlocking it with women of color, as well as trans women of color in particular, as well as trans and non-binary people generally, and not really taking that into account and really just centering cis white womanhood in a way that sort of eliminated or pressed down a lot of these important intersections that would have elucidated and strengthened their arguments that allowed them to then be co-opted by more anti-transgender movements that ultimately support things like the patriarchy. Hey, so future Jessie here, and here with the first addendum and honestly the longest one. Some folks have argued that Talia's discussion of trans men within the book Trans Red Femme is, to put it kindly, misguided. Some have even argued that it's outright offensive. That, for me personally, wasn't my read of the text, but I do see how people got there. But for me, from what I took away, Bhatt's argument isn't that trans men aren't men. It's that our patriarchal, misogynistic society that we have here in Western culture refuses to see them as men. Instead, it reads them as cis women who've been led astray by internalized misogyny or trauma, something J.K. Rowling herself argued in her infamous anti-trans screed when she came out as a TERF years ago. And it's a common TERF line, that trans men are just confused women who hate womanhood and need to be brought back into the fold of femininity and learn to accept their true womanhood, especially in an attempt to reify their reproductive role for heterosexual society, as well as a domestic role for them. It's why you see people like Matt Walsh hyper-focusing on how trans men's reproductive ability has been ruined or taken away, that like hyper-fixation on things like hysterectomies and things like that. And Bhatt's framing, as I read it in the book, is trying to expose that logic, not endorse it. To my read, she's discussing how patriarchal cultures dehumanize trans men by denying their identity and casting them as damaged when they no longer serve reproductive expectations. Another good example of this would be Irreversible Damage by Abigail Schreier, another TERF book, where the clear text of that book, right from the title of it, is that trans men are only valuable if they can still produce children, and if not, they're somehow irreversibly damaged. Now, that was my read of the book, but I also want to acknowledge that others, particularly some people within the trans masculine community, have found elements of the book that they believe echo harmful TERF talking points around trans men. Things like the idea that transitioning is a betrayal of womanhood, or that living authentically as a trans man is somehow inherently violent towards women generally. I personally didn't read Bhatt as arguing those things, but I'm also not a trans man. And while I'm personally familiar with a lot of the language TERFs use around trans men, that creepy, you'll never know a lover's caress LGB alliance kind of stuff, there are dog whistles or rhetorical landmines that I am not as sensitive to as a trans feminine person that I may have missed. So I want to give space for that possibility and, reading of the text. But relatedly to that, another piece of this discourse centers around the term transandrophobia, a word used to describe the specific forms of hatred and marginalization that trans men face. And personally, I understand the appeal of that term. A lot of trans men don't want to view their oppression solely through the lens of womanhood because they are men, so they don't like categorizing it under a framework of misogyny. And because there are indeed unique targeted experiences that affect people who are both trans and were assigned female at birth, there's a need for language that names those realities for trans men and trans masculine folks and non-binary folks who are masculine presenting. For example, many trans men, and et al., face exclusion from certain queer spaces that label themselves as for women and non-men, or bar male-identified people, a phrasing that, intentionally or not, is exclusionatory to trans men from queer spaces. Which can be complicated because, yes, I do believe trans women, women generally, trans femmes, non-binary folks, do need spaces that are separate to feel that sort of safe space, but then where does that sometimes leave trans men who have grown up in a world where they were seen as women, and in many cases still are, unfortunately, even though they are men, when they wish to have that space as well to discuss that. And we don't often offer those types of spaces as often to trans men. Not to say that we don't, but that's often not as presented as much as spaces for trans women. So there's a larger discussion there about the exclusion of trans men from a lot of queer organizing and spaces at times. There's also a long history of trans men being denied access to safe spaces, survivor circles, and healthcare, particularly around reproductive services, because their maleness or masculinity is seen as threatening, or lets their need for reproductive services be denied because their need for it is not even seen or understood, even when those services directly pertain to their bodies. And all of this happens in addition to much of the other violence that they may face as trans people, as people assigned female at birth, but also specifically as trans men. They're not embraced by systems designed to support men, in many cases cis men specifically, but are also pushed out of systems designed to support people assigned female at birth, and that can be a double bind. Now, some would frame these arguments within the broader system of misogyny, as Talia Bhatt does and argues within her book, arguing that trans men are still being perceived through a misogynistic lens and culture, even when that perception denies their manhood, even though they are, in fact, men, which Talia also asserts throughout the text. Others resist that framing, though, feeling that it erases trans men's lived experiences as men and mischaracterizes the nature of their marginalization. And that tension is part of the reason the term transandrophobia exists, to carve out language for those overlapping, often contradictory dynamics. But like I said earlier, the term itself comes with baggage. Some see it as reinforcing the myth of systemic misandry, which doesn't actually exist in any institutionalized or cultural form. And others argue it's not always precise enough to reflect how these intersecting systems really do operate, because again, there's no such thing as systemic misandry. Others also argue that the term doesn't fully capture how society uses misogyny to reclassify trans men, especially white trans men in Western contexts, as failed or wayward women whose bodies should be reclaimed for reproductive labor. And Talia talks about this within her book, but also outside of it, there was another controversy where she proposed an alternative term, transemasculization, a word that she used to describe how trans men are symbolically or socially reclaimed as women under systems of misogyny, even when they are not women. But some trans men have taken issue with that term as well, as it still centers their experience around the loss of masculinity, saying that they are emasculated. Something not all trans men feel describes their reality or want to use as the basis for discussion of the way that they are oppressed within our culture. Again, all of this is part of a much larger discourse, one that I cannot answer, but I do think it's worth noting here for those who want to dig deeper into the language and politics around this conversation, because I think it is one that we should be having. I think the experiences all of these words and discourses are trying to name are very real regardless of how we understand them, and we should be careful not to dismiss them just because the terminology or framework under which we try to analyze them is currently being debated. Like most things in trans discourse, it's messy. But that doesn't mean it's not worth talking about. Typically, it's the creation of ongoing discussion that is the most worthwhile thing to do. And I can't unpack all of this here, both because of time and honestly, my own mental and physical bandwidth at the moment, but it's something I do wish to explore personally and also write more about potentially in depth more one day. But for now, I at least want to acknowledge the criticisms that exist around Bhatt's work and say they weren't my personal interpretation of her work, but also affirm that those critiques deserve good faith discussion. In looking into this, I couldn't find a comprehensive analysis of Bhatt's work from a trans-masculine perspective. I was looking for essays on it or something like that, couldn't really find it. But I have included down below some essays by trans men engaging with discourse on the term transandrophobia. Personally, I found author Devin Price's piece particularly thoughtful, but I'm biased in that, which if you read it, you'll see why. Though I will say I did not realize the reason that I would be biased towards his essay until I was already well into it. But again, I encourage you to read all of them and, just start looking into more of the conversation, because I do think it's a nuanced and worthwhile conversation when it's had in good faith, which sadly within online discourses, it is not, I don't want to say typically, but can sometimes not be, and is used to both hurt trans men and women, as well as non-binary folks. But, what the hell else is new in trans discourse, unfortunately. Now, all of that sounds incredibly heady and like it'd be way down in theory, and that's actually why I kind of want to recommend this book most of all, because a lot of what she's sharing here is not stuff that I haven't heard before, yet Talia manages to take all of this very heady theory and make it feel very grounded and personable and easy to read and understand, because you can clearly tell the passion and, frankly, sometimes the anger that is behind a lot of her words. Righteous anger, and you can just feel that emotion right from the first page. Like, let me just read for you a couple passages from this book just to give you a sense of the emotion that's behind it. "I hold no reverence for your idols. I declare no allegiance to your priests. I do not honor the sanctity of your temples. I am not a shield for excusing the violence of men, nor a convenient scapegoat to butcher in their stead. I am neither an excuse to prop up anti-feminist sentiment, nor am I a voiceless puppet for whom others must speak. I'm a fucking tranny with something to say, here to remind you that we used to be regarded as oracles for a reason." So strong stuff there. So obviously very passionate, strong stuff there. And I don't want to sort of misrepresent the book and say like that anger is leaping off on every single page, but you can clearly sense that this is the framework that she's coming into this in, and you get that sense of like, I am saying this because I really, really feel this. And so when we get into her much more nuanced gender critique throughout the book, you feel that passion, and it allows you to guide through some more dense theory that other books just sort of get bogged down with, and she brings you through it in such a very personal way that I really, really loved. So you get passages like, "I hope this exploration of social constructs and the differing social meanings of race and gender was edifying in some way, and was at least easy to follow and understand. Transphobes in general really want to be able to unveil gender transition as a ridiculous, impossible farce, a reactionary desire that is itself a result of a poor understanding of how gender is socially constructed, and a denial of how trans people can and do materially alter their sex and gender positionally. Don't be tricked into believing that we're the ones ignoring the blatant truth in front of our eyes." So clearly, like, she's already talking about social constructs and social meaning and sort of racial and gender constructions, and yet you really get this sense of the passion that she has behind her words. And so much of this book is going through a lot of these dense ideas in that very passionate way. And one of the things that I found to be most insightful was how she linked a lot of this stuff to race, because a lot of the way that I have talked about gender theory and gender issues is to talk about it through the lens of white supremacy, because anti-transness and gender and all of these things are interlinked with white supremacy within our Western culture. And I think that that's an important thing to understand, especially within our culture today, in the sense that, like, a lot of the way that we have built up our gender comes from ways to delineate man from woman in order to push whiteness above blackness, and black womanhood as different from white womanhood. So there's obviously a colonialist undercurrent to a lot of that stuff. And I think that that's important to elucidate. But what she tries to make very, very clear is a tendency that we have, and I have done this myself, is that we tend to sort of place a specialness on how gender comes out of white supremacy within Western culture and Western civilizations like the United States, and tend to mythologize other cultures. Like, the whole latter half of this book is a wonderful discussion on how, many even feminists look at places like India and the sort of Haraja of India and sort of say, like, oh, they're this mystical third sex that are held up as special or are worshipped or given a place of honor. And she talks about, like, how a lot of the works that were written by Westerners talking about them is actually mythologizing them, is exoticizing them, and not understanding the ways in which patriarchy within places like India also affects these people. And so it's sort of pointing at how misogyny is an underlying structure of many different cultures and is not unique to Western culture, even if it is tied to white supremacy there. It is a underlying system that works throughout all of these different cultures in really, really insidious ways. And yeah, she talks about things like, how trans men, trans women, and women generally, the racial component of gender within our culture here in the United States, and she actually lives in the UK, she's in the United Kingdom, which is similar in a lot of respects. So she's not ignoring that stuff, but she is sort of more placing the emphasis on misogyny and how our society tends to create this hierarchy of man and woman, and yet also still creates a sort of third-sexed view of women, especially like trans women or women who can't reproduce, all to uphold a sort of culture of heterosexuality that places men above, women below, and then otherizes anyone else that doesn't fit into this binary conception as a third gender, even if they don't outright state that, and then shove them to the side or find ways to marginalize them. It's a really, really intelligent way to sort of structuralize a lot of this thinking. All right, final addendum here, and this is probably the critique that to me is the most interesting when it comes to the actual context of the book itself. In the latter third of the book, Talia spends her time arguing that patriarchy isn't a Western or European invention solely, which is 100% true. Patriarchy is a structure that appears across multiple cultures in multiple different ways. But the issue that some critics, including someone in my comment section who drew me to this criticism, and I would shout you out, but I don't want to just name you in case it causes problems for you, but let me know if you do want credit for making me aware of this. I'll pin you in the comments below, have raised the issue of how Talia tries to prove that overall point that she's making. She mainly points to India, which is a culture that she has a background in, as her primary example of non-Western patriarchy. And while that's valid, as a starting point to discuss non-Western patriarchies, it does become a problem to some when that example is then used to stand in for all of Asia or just generalized non-Western patriarchal cultures and used to generalize a universal experience. People have pointed out that this doesn't fully align with the complexities of gender structures in other Asian, indigenous, or non-Western cultures, and that is absolutely a fair critique. It's one of those moments where the argument has a strong foundation, but the evidence that she relies on is far too narrow. I do think that there is a worthwhile discussion to her general point, but even more significantly and relatedly, some point out how she engages with the discourse around third genders in non-Western societies can be narrow as well, let's just say. She rightfully critiques how white trans allies as well as European academia often mythologize or romanticize third-gendered roles in indigenous and colonized cultures and uses them as tools to validate transness in Western frameworks. And that's a real issue. But then she asserts that all of those roles are just ways of third-sexing trans women within those cultures. And I think her framework is a useful way to try to talk about the ways in which cultures try to create binary hierarchies of man and woman, and then anyone who doesn't necessarily fall into those categories in terms of a heterosexual reproductive cycle then gets placed into a third sex. Like how in Western cultures, for example, women who are unable to reproduce, whether they be cis or trans, are both placed into like a third sex category and not viewed as full women. And I think that that's an interesting framework to discuss patriarchal cultures through, regardless of whether they are Western or not. But to some critics, and I think it's very interesting that there's too much variation in how different cultures construct gender to universalize that claim totally. And it erases a lot of lived realities, especially for trans people, outside of her own cultural lens. So again, it's one of those things that I think there is worth in her framework of discussion, but also a lot of criticisms for how it cannot be universalized or how far we can extend that discourse and how it may flatten or erase other presentations, cultures, or lived experiences. And for me personally, I do want to apologize for not including or engaging with that discussion more directly in my original video, and it reaffirms how much, I still both don't know and also, to put more engagement into that topic and thought into that topic when I engage with it, especially off the cuff. I try to do my best when I'm writing something to think about all this stuff, but it's also something that is not my personal experience. So when I'm speaking off the cuff, it's not something that comes to me immediately. And in this context, especially talking about this book, it should have been something that I brought up. So that's on me. I do want to apologize for that. And I will say that, again, I think this is something that is well worth the discussion. And again, none of it is particularly new, but it is done in such a concise and passionate and thoughtful way that is really easily digestible to anyone who wants to pick up a book like this. This is not a 101 book necessarily. It's not something I would give to someone who's just learning about gender theory or things like that. But it is something who I would give to someone who I'm assuming most of you in my audience are people who like know enough about this stuff and are wanting to go a little bit deeper, but don't necessarily want to read like a 300-page book or that's like full of really dense words that is kind of a little bit harder to get into. Because I enjoy that stuff. For some people, it's a little bit more difficult. And again, sort of decentralizing the Western perspective in here, yet still speaking to an audience that she knows will be predominantly folks from that culture, I think is just an absolutely brilliant work. And I cannot recommend this book enough. If you have not had a chance to read it, I would highly recommend it. There's a couple things in here. She says something at some point in the book about like how we need to stop looking to the past because the past is not a place that we're going to be able to pull from to build something new, and so we should just let it die and it sort of it focus on just building the future because the past is pretty much predominantly run by patriarchal systems. And I don't even necessarily disagree with that, but you know, as someone I'm a big fan of Cruising Utopia by Jose Esteban Munoz, one of my favorite philosophers. And one of his big points was also to not like over-focus on the past because, as Talia also points out, like that's what fascists do. They create a mythologized past that we need to return to in order to try to just continually recreate the past and build up their sort of fascist utopian ideals or whatever. So, you know, I agree on that point, but Jose Esteban Munoz has this really beautiful thing about glancing to the past to sort of acknowledge trauma and pain and sort of like the history of where we come from. And I don't think Talia is ignoring that either. I don't think she would like disagree with that point. It's just one of those things where I'm like, oh yeah, I think that there's a little bit more that you could delve into here. And I again, I don't know her, so I couldn't speak for her, but I feel like that's something that she would agree with, just not something touched upon much within this book. But that's like, honestly, at the end of the day, just minor philosophical quibbles, not unimportant things, but ones that are sort of like, well, you know, there's a lot of discussion to be had there that, you know, wasn't her focus for this book that I think she would probably have many brilliant and wonderful thoughts on. So I think it's independently published. So, you know, it's always good to support an independent book author. So please go out and get her book. To be very clear, and ending, because this is my last sort of addendum, I do still think there's a lot of value in Bhatt's work, both in the other things I discussed as well as this discussion. I still recommend it. Her framing of misogyny, particularly as it operates within Western culture, which is where I live and where much of her book is focused, offers a useful, often sharp analytical lens. And in certain cultural contexts, especially Western ones, I think her perspective has real power. I also think she applies a lot of really good analysis on how Western culture has applied a Eurocentric lens to understanding other cultures. But I also think it's worth being critical and creating a discussion so as we don't overextend the universality of her analysis in ways that critics have argued that she may sometimes do towards the end of the book.